Suppose you went home this evening, you put on the TV news, and there was a story about the Prime Minister announcing today that spending on immunisation programmes for babies and young children was to stop as from October the 1st. That the relatively small amount of money that this would save would then be reinvested in providing for acute care for the rapidly rising number of young people who would then need care for those killer childhood diseases, which would obviously spread apace if we eliminated all immunisation. Now, just imagine that for a moment, the idea that a politician would say such a thing, I think we agree, is absurd. It is absurd, preposterous, because I think most of us think, as William Blake was writing some 200 years ago, that it is always better to prevent misery than it is to release from misery. We recognise that there is an overwhelming social and economic case for investment in an activity like an immunisation programme. Don't we? Well, let's just unpick that for a moment. Keep that principle in our head, but change the particulars. Suppose we talked instead about prison, about spending on the prevention of crime or on the rehabilitation of offenders, where we see that public opinion perhaps, and certainly public policy, takes a very different approach. And so it is that when the National Audit Office undertook what they describe as a landscape review looking at public services across the piece over the last 2 years, they reached the conclusion in the early part of this year that about 6%, just 6% of public expenditure is devoted to preventative activity, preventing problems from occurring rather than picking up the pieces afterwards. Just 6%. And perhaps more alarmingly still, that figure has remained very static for a number of years. The truth is that though it might be common sense, as the immunisation example illustrates, it isn't common practice. We do prevention very badly in this society, and most alarmingly of all, we are doing it worse than ever. Something like 9.2% of local authority spending on preventative activity was cut in the last year for which there are available figures, 2011-2012. So it's been prioritised less and less, despite the common sense arguments. Why does that matter? Well, imagine, if you will, a cliff. I want to talk about, at the top here, we have what we might consider to be primary prevention, the sort of universal services that keep us happy, enable us to fulfill our potential. Really good schools, for instance, health promotion programs, something like the vaccination work that I've already talked about. Towards the edge of the cliff, and with the light here, I'm not sure this shows up very well, but we have here a cliff coming down here. Towards the edge of the cliff, we have what we might consider to be the fences. Activities like, which we describe as secondary prevention, activities like family nurse partnerships, reading recovery programs for children who are struggling at school. Coming down the cliff, we have tertiary prevention, picking up those problems that have further developed. For instance, work with troubled families, work to prevent reoffending. So the difficulty is further developed. The intention of that work is to push those people who are using those services back up the cliff, ideally back up to the top. Then at the bottom, we have acute spending, activities, for instance, like a prison or an acute service in a hospital, where too often in our society now, we're not looking at how we help people to recover and climb back up the cliff, but rather we are crudely warehousing social need. Now, of course, as we come down the cliff, the activity becomes more expensive. It also becomes more expensive both financially and socially. It is less and less desirable to be at this point in the cliff. What we're seeing now at the moment is that these kinds of activities, what I described as the fences at the edge of the cliff, are the ones that are first to be cut. Where a child is a danger to himself or others at the bottom here, we as a society have to do something about it. Local authority or central government have to do something about it. Detached youth work, the fence at the edge of the cliff here, isn't a statutory responsibility. That can go. So the picture we are seeing at the moment is less and less spending towards the top, more and more need towards the bottom, more and more spending towards the bottom. Now imagine instead a society that didn't, as we now do, wait for trouble and respond at the last possible moment with a last resort service, waiting for that difficulty, but rather that was ready for everything. Suppose the model that we had of our society was that our services would be based on an idea of readiness, that our children at 3, 4, 5 years old would be ready for school. What would we need to do before those years to reach that point, to ensure that our 10 and 11-year-olds were ready to make the transition into secondary school and to work effectively in that different environment? To make sure that by the time we reach 17 or 18, we are ready to cope with the world of work, ready later on to be parents when that time comes. And ready also, because bad stuff happens too, to cope with adversity, to cope with the breakdown of a relationship, with losing work, losing our income. But essentially a community that is ready for everything. Now suppose that, instead of what we now talk about in public policy terms, resilience, became the central organising idea. Resilience is part of what we need to do, but life isn't just about how we respond to problems, it's also about how we seize opportunities. So building a community that is ready for everything would position us right at the top here. Ultimately, it would reduce expenditure coming further down the cliff, as well as being socially worthwhile. Now, is that a fanciful idea? Well, certainly if you look at where we spend at the moment, too much public expenditure devoted to picking up the pieces after a failed transition, after the 11-year-old has failed to make the transition successfully into secondary school, after the prison leaver has reoffended. Over and over again, public expenditure clusters around the failure for us to respond effectively at an earlier stage. But if readiness was the explicit objective of every government service, every government policy, every institution, we would think entirely differently. And in particular, what we would do is make longer-term planning our goal. Preventative activity, early action, doesn't stack up if you just think about it over a year. But if you think about vaccination, for instance, going back to where we started, the economic and the social case stacks up over a longer period of time. A survey at Christmas time, last Christmas, asked politicians of all parties what they thought was the UK's greatest achievement over recent years. It probably won't surprise you to know that overwhelmingly the choice was the Olympics and the Paralympics of 2012. What's fascinating about that is, well, three things. First of all, that was a long-term commitment. Second, that it was delivered by successive administrations. It wasn't identified either locally or nationally with a single party. And third, relevant to our conversation this evening, it cost £11 billion, which happens to be the same amount that youth offending costs the UK economy every single year. Yet out of that 11 billion that we spend on youth offending, less than 10% goes on prevention. We don't apply that long-term thinking to that money. If we did, we would spend the bulk of it on a preventative activity. We have no more than a passing thought for the future. If readiness were the underpinning goal, long-term planning would become the operational expectation across our public services. And we would then move to a different kind of politics, a different kind of public service, and ultimately, I think, a different kind of society, one that prevented rather than picked up the pieces. I acknowledge that it wouldn't work on every issue, but on the many that it would certainly make us and our politicians give far, far more to make us proud than just one glorious summer. Thank you all.